Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of the Triangle Area SQL Server User Group's main meeting. We are here, joined today with Frank Gill, who's going to talk to us about high availability disaster recovery and using DBA tools to effect such things. So please, Frank, take it away.
All right. So I'm going to cut my camera while I present, and there'll be some breaks throughout the presentation that will give you the opportunity to ask questions in the chat. Let me share out. And Kevin, you can see my screen okay?
Coming through perfectly.
All right, great. So as Kevin said, I'm going to talk about managing high availability and disaster recovery in SQL Server using DBA tools. A little bit about me very quickly. I've been in IT for 23 years now. The last 15 of that, I've been working with SQL Server. I started out as kind of a traditional admin, and then for the past 7 years or so, I have been working as a consultant. So right now I'm a senior consultant at Fortified Data, a small consulting firm based in North Carolina. I love to learn, and presenting is a great way to do it. Every time I build one of these, I learn more about the topic than I thought I could. And every time I do a presentation, I will get questions that I don't have the answers to. So it's sort of a continuous cycle. I love internals. If you have questions about the transaction log or how data is stored on a page, you can feel free to ask questions of me. I joke that I like to talk about this stuff and my wife doesn't. Prior to March of 2020, I was a volunteer at the Art Institute of Chicago, one of my favorite places in the world. Try to get down there as often as I can, but I'm itching to get back to volunteer. And then finally, I've got my contact information here. You can message me on Twitter at ScreebyDBA. My email address is screebydba@gmail.com, and my blog, which I need to start updating. I made a resolution at the beginning of the year that I'd update it more frequently, and it hasn't happened. So fingers crossed I can get to that sometime soon. This presentation, there'll be a link in the resources section to a book called DBA Tools in a Month of Lunches. This is a book that is written by Chrissy Lemire, Rob Sewell, Jess Pomfret, and Claudio Silva. And those four people are really instrumental in the development of DBA tools, which I'll explain what that is a little bit later on. But if you are interested in learning how to use PowerShell to administer SQL Server, this is a great book. You can see across the cover of the book, you've got the letters MEAP. It stands for Manning Early Access Program. So Manning is the publisher of the book. What they do is they contract with someone to write a book, and then as chapters are completed, those chapters become available online. And you can buy a print copy of the book and an electronic copy, or you can just buy the electronic copy. And one of the really nice things about their electronic books is that they have a feature called Live Book, which allows you to access the book online. And that's actually how I built this presentation, or at least the outline for this presentation. Is I was waiting for my oil to get changed, and I pulled the Live Book up on my phone and just was going through and looking for ideas. And so that's where this was born. So as I said, there'll be a link in the resources section to get you there. We're going to talk about what DBA Tools is. We're going to talk about high availability and disaster recovery in SQL Server, various options that are available, and then how to configure Logshipping with DBA Tools, how to monitor a failover cluster instance with DBA Tools, and then how to create, configure, and monitor availability groups with DBA Tools. So, DBA Tools. The official word is a community module that enables SQL Server pros to automate database development and server administration. My take on it is that, along with Ola Hollengren's maintenance solution and baseballreference.com, this is one of the coolest things on the internet. It is a community-developed PowerShell module. It started out as a migration tool, and you can still use it as a migration tool. There is a command within DBAtools called start migration, and in its simplest form, you give it a source instance and a destination instance, and it will run through and it will migrate everything from source to destination. Databases, logins, jobs, linked servers, you name it, it will move it. And I started, like I said, I started my career as kind of a traditional admin, and I did a fair amount of migration work. The first project I worked on was taking somewhere in the order of 2,000 instances of SQL Server and consolidating them into 200 FCIs, 200 failover cluster instances. And that was painful. The first time I ran the start DBA migration command, I nearly cried because it was so easy. And it's really remarkable what you can do with it. In addition to start DBA migration, there are about 500 other commands. And anything that you can do with SQL Server, with a few exceptions, you can do using DBAtools. And they're continuing to add functionality as new features come out, as existing features kind of get extended. There are commands to handle that kind of thing. So the most important thing is that you have the ability to automate things. And in terms of HADR, it may not be automating, but standardizing things. So you can manage, administer, configure the HADR options that I'm going to show you using Management Studio or using T-SQL scripts. But the challenge there is that if you're going through the GUI in Management Studio, you are going through a bunch of screens and entering a bunch of information, and you can script that out at the end, but your script is going to contain all of the values that you entered into the GUI. So if I need to set up Logshipping on one server and then set it up on a second, or between a pair of instances, and then set it up with another pair of instances, I need to either go through the GUI again and enter all that information, or go through my script and change those hard-coded values. What DBAtools gives you the ability to do is, because it's PowerShell based, you can write a script and use parameters that can be passed in, and you can reuse the scripts over and over again. So if you, for example, need to set up your Logshipping in the same way in multiple places, you can use these scripts and just plug in the names of the instances and databases that you're interested in. So it can just bear a lot of fruit in terms of standardization and ease of configuration and implementation. So to get the module, if you're in an administrator PowerShell window, all you need to do is type install-module and then DBAtools. And as long as you have the rights to pull something down from the internet on the computer you're on, it will prompt you for to install a new version of NuGet, which is the application or the command that actually pulls the module down. And then it'll ask you if you want to install the module. And once you do that, it will install the module and you're done. And if you go to dbatools.io, you can find all of the documentation about the commands. Everything in DBAtools is open source. So not only do they have everything documented in terms of the parameters and the output and examples of the code, you can also click through a link and go to GitHub and see exactly what the modules are doing, what the commands are doing. So if you have a need outside of what they're doing or on top of what's going on, you can pull that code down and customize it. And then also, as I said, the automated this install module method will work if the system you're on has access to the internet. And if you're working on a enterprise server, that may not be the case, or there could be policies in place that would block your ability to download things. There are additional options for getting a hold of DBAtools at that link. So this is a high-level list of the categories of commands. The three I'm going to focus on are availability groups, Logshipping, and Windows Server Failover Cluster. But backup and restore is something that is really great. Trying to think what else I use on a regular basis. TempDB, you can run a command and it will automatically create files and resize files for your TempDB to adhere to best practice. There's just a ton of stuff here, and I think it's worth anybody's while to kind of just poke around and see what is here and what you can do, because it's pretty amazing. So Kevin, any questions at this point?
So chat, if there are any questions, it's a good time to enter them. Frankly, any time's a good time to enter questions. Now is a good time for me to answer questions by passing them along to Frank. Looks like so far nothing yet, but we do have a fellow Chicagoan in the audience. So you got that going for you.
Okay. All right. All right. So just want to give an overview of the HADR options in SQL, and I will talk about each of these in terms of DBAtools. So you got Logshipping, Failover Cluster Instance, and Availability Groups. Logshipping has been around forever, and I'm not sure how long forever is, but I think it's been around, it's at least SQL Server 7, if not longer than that. And Logshipping is it's just a workhorse. It is something that, for a while, Microsoft was talking about deprecating Logshipping and then removing it from the product. And they decided not to do that because they kind of changed the direction, and they aren't going to remove functionality because they don't want to break people who are using older technology. But even if they were to have removed Logshipping, it is something that you can build yourself. What Logshipping does is it performs 3 phases. You've got a primary and a secondary. So I have a database running on my primary instance, and I want to push the transactions that are running on that primary instance to a secondary. And so what I do is I have a job that at some interval runs transaction log backups of that database. There is a second job that then it backs them up to a share that both the primary and the secondary have access to. And then there are 2 jobs on that secondary instance. One copies that log backup from that shared location to the secondary instance locally, and then it does a restore. As I said, all 3 phases are run by SQL agent jobs. You can set this up on using Management Studio, and you can roll your own. You do have limited read-only capability on the secondary instance. So by default, the database on the secondary will be in restoring state or in recovery, because it needs to be able to apply additional transaction log backups. You can set it to what's called standby, and that sets it to read only. The challenge there is that log backups cannot be applied when there is someone active in the database. And so you either need to kick all the connections out to do the restore, or you have to wait until people are out for that restore to run. One of the nice things about Logshipping is that if any one of these 3 phases stops working, the other phases will continue to run. So I had a case where I had a client who we had implemented Logshipping for them. We were writing files to a network share, and the secondary server lost connectivity with that network share. I think it was on a Sunday, late on a Sunday. And so we came in Monday, we got alerts that it had happened. They fixed that network connectivity, and those log backups had continued to write to that share. So when network connectivity was reestablished, the job started running successfully on the secondary, and it picked up the log files that had been written, log backup files that had been written, and just kind of healed itself. So it's robust technology. It has that has its use. Couple of requirements: your agent account's got to be an Active Directory account. You need to grant various permissions for that agent account to the backup destination and the copy destination. And if you decide to run the demo code that I'm going to show you, you'll need to meet these requirements. So I just want to call that out. And I will show you what this looks like. And Kevin, give a shout if there are any questions.
Will do.
Okay. Okay, so just to show you what I'm working with here, I have 2 instances of SQL Server. This one is just the default instance on my laptop, and then I have a named instance called Tony, and I have a database called LS Test, and this is the database that I am going to set up Logshipping for. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure that I don't have Logshipping set up, and I want to make sure that I don't have the database on my secondary. So I'm going to execute this. All right, so everything should be cleaned up. And then these first 3 commands are just cleaning up the, because I'm doing this all on my laptop, everything is local. So I've got 2 folders on my C drive and then a share that I've created. I just want to make sure that everything is removed from those folders, because if there's stuff hanging around from a previous run, it can break the process. And then this is a parameter block in PowerShell, and this makes for cleaner code. So the invoke DB Logshipping command, and this is a DBAtools command, takes all of these parameters as input. And if I was to run this on a single line, I would have each of these parameter names with a dash in front of them equals this value. And that can get really long and hard to read. So by coding $params equal, and then this @ curly braces wrapping all of these parameter names with their values, I can set them up here and then just use @params to pull them all in as parameters to the command. So it just makes the PowerShell easier to read. So I'm going to run this. And what it is doing is it is building out those 3 agent jobs that I told you about, and then it is going to fire them the first time. So it's going to run, in this case, both a full and a log backup of the database, the LS test database, which I've got specified here. It is going to restore that full and the log on the secondary side, and it is going to, in this case, the jobs aren't going to be scheduled. You can see that I've got these params backup schedule disabled, copy schedule disabled, and restore schedule disabled set to true, because I don't want those jobs running while I'm doing my demo. If you set those to false or you don't specify those parameters, it defaults to false. It will automatically schedule those jobs to run every 15 minutes. And you can adjust that if you want, but that is the SQL Server default if you were to do it through Management Studio. So that has completed. If I scroll down a little bit, it tells me that the result was success. Oh, and one other thing I'll mention is that one of these parameters is a secondary database suffix. I have that set to DR. So my primary database is LS test, and the database on the secondary side is going to be LSDR. So if I come over to this, you can see here's my LS test. If I open up SQL Server agent jobs. Zoom in. That ls backup underscore ls test, that is the backup job. And then if I expand out on the secondary side, there's my ls test dr database. And then you can see down at the bottom under jobs, I've got my ls copy, and that's jobs going to copy it from the share locally. And then the restore is going to do the restore of the log backup. So that is how you can set this up. And like I said, this is reusable. You know, you could save this script and then just change the instances in the database that you're going to create Logshipping for, and you're good to go. And you can standardize that setup. Just to show you what this looks like. So this is just going to run a select from everything in the one table that's in the LS database on both instances. So if I run this, you can see that each table has a single row, and that row is one Logshipping. Those are the 3 columns. I'm going to insert a second row into the table on the primary side. And if I rerun those selects, you'll now see that on the default instance, I've got 2 rows. So I've got Logshipping, and then the second row is resilient. And then on the secondary side, it's still just that single row because I haven't pushed anything over there yet. So what I'm going to do is execute those 3 jobs, the backup, copy, and restore. And I've got to start sleeping here just to make sure that each job finishes before the next one runs. So run this, it'll take about 10 to 12 seconds. There's the copy, and the backup should run. Yep, so all 3 have completed. Now if I select from the primary and secondary tables, I've got 2 rows on each side. So the log backup was taken from the primary side, copied over, and then restored, and it included that second row that I had inserted on the primary side. So that is how the process works. And then finally, what I want to do is show you how you would run a cutover. So you can automate failover with Logshipping, but it's outside of the scope of what I'm doing here. But you can also do it manually, and you can do it using DBAtools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the SQL Server service for my primary instance. And then I'm going to run this stop DBA process, which is another DBAtools command. And what this does is it's going to kill any connections to the LS test DR database on my named instance. And the reason I'm doing that is because the invoke DB Logship Recovery, what that is going to do, and actually I didn't show you. No, I don't want to restart. So next to LS Test DR here in Management Studio, you can see I've got standby read-only. So that is the state that it's in. So it's in a read-only state. So what the invoke DBA Logship Recovery is going to do is it's going to pull a log backup from the primary side, apply it to the secondary, and apply it with recovery. So it's going to make that recoverable. Okay, so let me run this. So I'm going to stop the service, mimicking a failure of my primary. I'm going to kill all those processes on the secondary. And then you'll see some messages down here that databases, master, tempdb, model, MSDB, are not configured for Logshipping. Because what this command does is it runs through and just looks at all of the databases on the instance, and it will only recover those that are set up for Logshipping. So now if we come back over and I do a refresh on, let's test if it worked the way it was supposed to. Yep. So you can see that it is no longer standby read only. It is now acting like a normal database. And you can see if you look down at the instance below, the default instance, you can see that it is stopped. So it's basically that failed and put the DR database into a usable mode. And just to prove that that's true, I'm just going to run a select from the named instance, and my 2 rows are still there. And then just for my own peace of mind, I'm going to restart that default instance. So that is setting up Logshipping with DBAtools. As I said, it's just incredibly useful to be able to code this script once and then save it and reuse it. And there's a lot of other parameters that you can add in. There's a lot of functionality that you can customize. So it's just a nifty tool. So Kevin, any questions at this point?
Looks like no questions at all yet. It's really easy to
tell if everybody's still
when you
awake.
see how it works. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are SQL Server failover cluster instances. So a failover clustered instance, or an FCI, is an instance of SQL Server running as a clustered resource in a failover cluster. So to create an FCI, you need at least 2 servers or 2 nodes in a Windows Server failover cluster. And you have this instance. There is 1 primary and at least 1 secondary or active. It's actually active and passive with clustering because Microsoft likes to call things different things. But I have, a server that the instance is running on. One of the drawbacks to failover clustering is that you're required to have shared storage. So there has to be some storage available that both servers can read from and write to. So you've got things running on your active node, you're writing everything to the data file and the transaction log. When the instance of SQL Server fails over, what happens is the SQL Server service is shut down on that primary node, and then the cluster moves or points to the secondary node and brings those services up on the secondary side. And that secondary, which is now the primary, is reading from those same data and log files. So the failover is at the instance level. And as I said, shared storage is a problem. But the nice thing is that because the instances are reading from the same storage, everything on the instance, so anything that's in the master database, anything that's in MSDB, so all of your agent jobs, all of your logins, all of that is picked up on the secondary side at failover. So there are pros and cons. So failover clusters, because the Windows Server failover cluster is a Windows thing, you can set up a Windows Server failover cluster for things other than SQL Server. DBAtools doesn't have commands to build out a failover cluster, but they do have commands about returning information about failover cluster instances. This can be really useful when you're gathering information about an FCI or FCIs within an environment. For example, me as a consultant, if I come in and I find out, okay, we've got X number of clusters in our environment, but we really don't know what that inventory looks like, I can use the commands that I'm showing you to pull that inventory back, and it can be very useful. So just to show you what those are, So there's get DBA WSFC, and that's Windows Server Failover Cluster node. And all I need to do is give it a computer name. So if I know that there is a computer called my server 1 that is participating in a cluster, I can run that and it will pull back information about all of the nodes in the cluster. So that gives me the cluster name, it gives me the cluster's fully qualified domain name, and then the name of each of those nodes. And then if you had a primary owner or contact, and if it was dedicated, you'd see that information as well. So it will quickly pull that back. And because this is PowerShell code, you can format this. You can export this to a CSV. There's just a ton of stuff you can do with the output. That's the first commandlets. The second one is about failover cluster roles. And so these are roles within the cluster. The first one I'll just focus on is the available storage. So this will show me the storage that is available to the cluster and the storage that is shared between the nodes. So just more inventory information you can pull back, and it's very similar. Get DBA WSFC role, give it a computer name. You can also give it a cluster name. There are a bunch of different parameters you can pass in. And then finally, get DBA WSFC resource. And this will pull back information about the resources running underneath the FCI. And here you can actually see the physical disks that are running underneath it. And then it's showing me that both the SQL Server and SQL Server agent services are resources in the cluster. And so the 2 cluster disks that you see, both primary and secondary can see those. And then those services will come down on the primary, move over to the secondary and on failover, and then the secondary will become the primary and will own those services. So those are the failover cluster commands that are available. And that takes us to availability groups.
Oh, sorry. We had a question on failover cluster instance commandlets. And the question was, could that be run against any node in the cluster, or does it have to be against the primary?
No, any node in the cluster, because each node in the cluster is participating in the group, and then it has access to all of the information. And so, like I said, that's one of the nice things about it, is somebody can tell me we've got a 4-node cluster and we know that this node's primary right now. I can run it against that node. It'll pull back everything. And then the same goes if they give me a secondary node or they give me the cluster name. I can pull all the information back.
Very good. Thank you.
No problem. Give me 1 second. All right. So, having moved from Logshipping to failover cluster instances, we're now going to move into availability groups. So availability groups are functionality that were introduced by Microsoft with SQL Server 2012. And they provide it's a more flexible high availability solution for a lot of reasons. So you need to build out a Windows Server failover cluster. And with availability groups, you have what are called replicas. So you have a primary replica, and then you could have up to 8 secondary replicas. And all of the replicas in the availability group have to be part of a failover cluster. If you're going to run a traditional AG with the functionality I'm talking about, there are sort of other flavors of availability groups that I'm not going to get into here, but if you have questions about anything else involving availability groups, feel free to ask me. One of the bonuses here from my perspective is there is no shared storage. Each replica has their own data and log files local to the instance. So the databases are contained in availability groups. So we talked about failover cluster instances where everything fails over together. The entire instance fails over. Availability groups allow you to group databases together. So for example, if I have a server that's running databases that are associated with, let's say, claims, if I'm an insurance company, claims and billing. They're two different applications. They each have their own databases. I can group those into a claims availability group and a billing availability group, and then I can fail those back and forth independently of one another. One instance can host multiple availability groups. There are limits here, and I would advise not trying to push the limits because you can run into problems. More databases and more availability groups can run the instance out of resources. So just be careful. And then, as I said, failover is at that availability group level. The way that this works is I have my primary replica and I'm writing transactions to the transaction log on the primary. As those transactions are hardened to the log on the primary, they are being written to the secondaries, and then they are applied on the secondary side. You've got two options for that log traffic. It can be synchronous or it can be asynchronous. In synchronous mode, it's a process where I write the records to the log on the primary, those records are written to the secondary, and then a notification is sent back from a secondary to primary that the log records have been hardened on the secondary side. And then transactions commit and are hardened on the primary side. And what that does is it guarantees that you can fail over without data loss, because it won't let the primary harden things unless the secondary has done it first. And so you are confident that on failover, when you get to the secondary, everything that you had written to the primary will still be there. Asynchronous means that those log blocks are being passed over to the secondary, and it just applies them as it can. And so if you're running in asynchronous mode and you try to fail over, it's going to warn you that, yeah, you can do this, but you may encounter data loss because there could be data that's not applied on the secondary. This allows nodes to be geolocated. I said before, failover cluster instances need shared storage, and you can geolocate cluster instances, but you need to have some way to have all of your cluster nodes see the same storage, and that can be expensive and challenging. Because all of this stuff is sitting locally, it's not a problem. As long as you have connectivity between your replicas, you can do what you want to do in terms of geolocation. The kind of standard architecture of this from Microsoft is I've got two data centers. My primary data center, I have my primary replica and a secondary replica. That is running synchronous because those are in the same building, possibly in the same rack, and I don't have much latency there. And there I can have automatic failover. So it will fail between those. If there's an issue with one, it will fail to the other. And then in my second data center, I have an async secondary, which provides DR. So if something goes horribly wrong in my primary data center, I lose power, somebody cuts a cable, I can fail over to that secondary in a disaster recovery situation. And just something to keep in mind is kind of the difference between high availability and disaster recovery. High availability is there to maintain the availability of the database. Disaster recovery is there in the event of a disaster. So you can't expect, I've had clients who don't understand why when their data centers are 100 miles apart, they can't set the secondary in the second data center to synchronous. and just trying to explain physics. It's about physics and how fast things can go through copper. You've got latency. So just keep in mind the difference between HA and DR. Another bonus with availability groups is you can set your secondary replicas to be read-only, and you can route traffic to those read-only replicas. So if I have an application, I'm writing all my transactional data to my primary, but we have people that want to do reporting. Those reporting applications can put a param in their connection string called application intent equals read only. And with that, the availability group is smart enough to know to route that traffic to a readable secondary. So it will offload that reporting activity from your primary OLTP system. So there's a lot of neat features here. So as I kind of talked through some of this before, if you're in synchronous, a failover is not going to cause data loss. You can set failover to be automatic, providing high availability. So I kind of talked through all of this. If you do want to do a failover to an async secondary, the standard way of doing it is to switch to synchronous commit, wait for it to catch up, and you can monitor that in a couple of different ways. And once it is caught up and everything, you're guaranteed you'll have no data loss, then perform that manual failover. So you can do it, it just takes an extra step. So that will take us to the demo. Let me find the right window. Too many windows open. All right, give me 1 second. Somehow closed a connection to one of my VMs. So what I've got is 3 VMs running in Azure, and I built out a cluster and put them in the cluster. And you have to enable availability, the always-on availability groups at the instance level. And I've got information in the notebook I'm going to show you about the prerequisites. I apologize. I don't know how that got closed out. Got any questions coming across while I'm waiting for things to open?
No questions at the moment.
Let's see what's going to go on. So as I said, I've got three servers. 2 of them are nodes or 2 of the replicas in my, or running replicas in my availability group. The third is a domain controller. So to set up the cluster, you need a domain, and you need to be able to have these things talk to each other through failover clustering. So this is a machine I'm on right now, which may have been a mistake because I set this up as 1 core with 3.5 gig of memory, which is why it is running as slow as it is. So if this doesn't come back quickly, I will punt and pull it up on one of the nodes, but let's see. Okay. So as I said, this is my the notebook I'm going to run through, and it has a list of prerequisites. You need at least 2 servers joined to a failover cluster without shared storage. You've got to be running enterprise or developer edition. So availability groups in the form I'm showing you here are an enterprise-only feature. The log and data paths should be the same. I think if you read Microsoft's documentation, it will say they must be the same. They don't, but if you value your sanity, make them the same, because it's just a nightmare to try to troubleshoot if they're not. You enable always-on availability groups for each instance to be added. You can do this from SQL Server Configuration Manager. If you look at the properties for the SQL Server service in Configuration Manager, you'll have a tab for always on. You'll only be able to enable it if the instance is joined to a cluster. So, and you can also do that with DBAtools. There's an enable DBA HADR that will flip that switch. And then any database that's going to be added to the availability group, it has to be in full recovery, and you have to have run a full backup. So for this example, I'm using wide world importers. That database isn't simple when you restore it. So you've got to run, set the recovery to full, and then run that full backup to actually get that change to take. The example I'm going to use uses what's called automatic seeding. So like with Logshipping, I talked about how on that initial setup, it was pulling a full backup from the primary, applying it on the secondary, and then a log backup, applying that on the secondary. When availability groups first came out, the option you had to build an availability group was to manually pull a full backup from your primary, restore it to all your secondary nodes, and then pull a log backup and do the same thing. And then they added functionality where you could provide a shared location, and SQL Server would do that for you. It would run the full and the log right to the share, and then the replicas would pull the restore from there. With 2016, I believe, they introduced what's called automatic seeding. And this is basically an automatic process behind the scenes that when you add a database into the availability group on the primary, it will automatically kick off a process to start seeding it on your secondary nodes. So that's what I'm going to do here. And once again, I've got a parameter block, and I've got my primary and secondary nodes. I am naming my availability group, telling it what database I want to add, and this is a comma delimited list. So if I have multiple databases, I can drop them in here. My seeding mode is set to automatic. These next two parameters, database health trigger is equal to true, as is DTC support. So with 2016, they added functionality in where prior to 2016, 2012, 2014, if something went wrong with a database in an availability group and it became inaccessible, it would not force a failover because it was only things that were happening at the availability group level, at the cluster level effectively, that would force that failover. So by setting this database health trigger equal true, it will see issues at the database level and force a failover. And then DTC support, you can use distributed transactions in availability groups, and that is also new in 2016. And then finally, the confirm equals false just says, don't ask me any questions, just do what I tell you to do, because running in a notebook like I am in Azure Data Studio, it will not pop up any sort of dialogue to say, yes, I really want to do this. So before I kick that off, just want to show you that I don't have anything on my sleeve. Let me connect to what is the primary. Okay, so I've got a single database on this instance, and I don't have Zoomit installed here. So, but wide world importers, and then here's always on high availability. And I currently have no availability groups configured on this instance. So I'm going to run new DBA availability group with the parameters you see here. And I doesn't it like about params? Oh, because I'm running in SQL. So if you're not familiar with Azure Data Studio, it is a tool that you can use to connect to SQL Server databases and do a bunch of other stuff. It features what are called notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, which is what I'm running here. And you can use either SQL or PowerShell. And I don't know why it's not switching. Hang on 1 second. Cancel. Yeah, because I don't need to connect. All right, hold on 1 more second. I'm going to close that and start it again and see if that solves my problem. There we go. So the kernel tells it what the code. So basically what the notebook gives you the ability to do is create formatted text like you see here in a cell, and then I can put runnable code in the notebook. You can only put one type of runnable code, so PowerShell or SQL or the various flavors of Python and Spark, but I needed to flip to the PowerShell kernel. So let's try running this now. It should run fairly quickly. Famous last words. Let's see if we got anything yet. Okay, so we do have an availability group. It is still running, but if I expand this out, you can see that I've got 2 replicas and a database. And the reason I'm flipping between Azure Data Studio and Management Studio is that Management Studio has better visibility into the actual structure of the availability group. If I right click on this primary node, I can show dashboard, and this will show me the state of the availability group. So, okay, so everything's green at the replica level. Give this a second. I should be seeing, there we go. Okay. So the way that this reads is up here at the top, the availability group state is healthy. And then I can see that each of my replicas is healthy. And it tells me what their role is, primary or secondary, what the availability mode is. So they're both synchronous commit. My failover set to automatic, as is my seeding. And then my synchronization state is synchronized. So with a synchronous replica, that is what you want to see. You want to see synchronized. If you have an async replica, this will read synchronizing, and that indicates healthy. And then here you can see that on both sides, my wild world importers database is there, and it is synchronized with no data loss. Expand that out. And let me just connect to my secondary, and you can see what it looks like on that side. So I've got wide world importers on the secondary. You can see it is synchronized. And if I expand out availability groups here, I am secondary, and I've got the same replicas and database. So that one command built out my availability group, set up the seating, made sure that everything got created the way it was supposed to. And it's just nifty because to do that using the GUI, I'd go through like 10 different windows and I have to change information, enter information at each step. Here, I've got this one script. I can reuse this. I just give it different primary and secondary names, different availability group names, different database names. And once again, there are more parameters that you can specify. So if you look at the documentation for the command, you can see what those are. So talked about with FCIs, I'm failing the instance over. So master goes with, MSD goes with, and as a result, all my logins go, all of my jobs go. Because the database storage is local, I am not doing anything with master or MSDB. And that means that if I have my primary and I'm running everything against my primary and I create a job on my primary, that job is not going to get automatically created on the secondary side. And so if I have processes that need to run and I'm set up to fail over automatically, I need to make sure that anything on the primary side gets pushed to the secondaries. And DBAtools will do that for you. So what I'm going to do is show you another cool thing with DBAtools. There is a command called install DBA maintenance solution. And this will install Ola Hollengren's maintenance solution. So I got the commandlet, I give it a SQL instance, I tell it what database I'm going to put it in. I'm going to just put it in master. You can put it in any database you want. You know, there's certain shops I've been in where you don't write anything to master. You've got a DBA database or some kind of an admin database, so you can do that. I'm going to replace anything that exists, and I'm going to install the jobs. So let me run this. And if we take a look at my primary, why didn't that work? Let's try that one more time. Okay. Refresh my jobs. And I've got Ola's jobs. So the maintenance solution creates a full backup job for system databases, diff full and log for user, integrity checks for system and user, and then index optimized for user. So I've got all of those jobs on my primary. Actually, I'll show you in here. So this is another DBAtools command, get agent job. So I'm pointing at both my primary and secondary instance, and I want to pull back any jobs that are in the category database maintenance. And I just want to select the computer name and the job name. So if I run this, you will see that I've got all of Ola's jobs plus a couple of extra jobs on the primary, this VM2, but I just have those 4 kind of standard jobs on the secondary. So created them here, they're not here. So if I was to fail over and these jobs were scheduled to run my backups, I would no longer be getting backups, which is bad. And we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is run another DBAtools command called sync DBA availability group. And that will sync all of the object types that you see here. So it's going to sync up your SP configure, any custom errors you've got, credentials, database mail, link to servers. You can read the list for yourself. The one that I am concerned about here is agent job. So what I'm going to do is run this. And there is no include parm. You can just exclude things. So I've got my primary, my secondary, my availability group name, and then I'm going to exclude everything except for agent jobs. So let me run this. And you can see that it shows me that it skipped a number of jobs because they already exist, but these jobs were successful. And I'm not sure why it's showing me that they were skipped. I don't know exactly what's going on there. I have to figure that out. But upshot is, if I come back over to my secondary, to my VM3, and I expand out agent and jobs, those jobs are all here now. So it has copied them all over. If I told it to copy logins and I had logins I needed to transfer, it would have copied those over as well, along with anything else in that bulleted list I showed you. So you can set this up to run in an agent job that gets triggered on failover. And so, or you can do it on a schedule. You could do it both ways. You could say, every night at 1 a.m., I want to run this, make sure that everything's synced. And then you could set it up. There is a specific error code that generates on failover. When you see that error code, you could fire this off and just guarantee that everything is synced. So it's just very, very nifty. And then finally, I can fail over an availability group using invoke DBA AG failover. In this case, you give it the instance that you're failing to, you give it the availability group name, and then I've got a force parameter to stop it from prompting me. And then one last step you need to do here is, if you do a failover of the availability group through Management Studio, which you can do, there is a step that the GUI runs to resume data movement. So if I right-click on the database name, you can see that I have the ability to suspend data movement, and that will stop data from being pushed from primary to secondary. When you run the failover command, data transfer is suspended by default because they want to make sure that everything is right before they start transferring data. So I've got the invoke DBA AG failover, and right after that, resume DBA AG DB data movement. And in this case, you specify the secondary. So I've got new primary and old primary, failing over to the new primary, and then my old primary, I'm going to resume for the wide world importers database. So let me just kick this off. Hopefully we'll come back quickly. Yep. Okay. So it's showing me now that VM2, which had been primary, is now secondary. If I come back over here, let me go to 3. If I refresh availability groups, you can see I'm now primary here. And if I right click and pull up my dashboard, everything is green. And it can take a little bit to catch up depending on how active your databases are and how much stuff is being written over. But it should come back pretty quickly. So 2 is now secondary, 3 is primary. Everything is green, everything is good with the world. Let's see if I think that is all for the notebook. A couple of other things I'll point out. So in the state that this availability group is in right now, I need to connect to the actual instance name. So I'm connected to VM2, I'm connected to VM3. You have the ability in an availability group to create what's called a listener, and I don't have one set up. And that's something I want to add to this. It just would add to the time it would take me to do this. But what the listener does is it's a cluster resource that it acts kind of like a traffic cop. So if your connection string is connecting to the listener, when that failover happens, traffic will automatically route to the new primary. So it gives you that flexibility. And with availability groups in synchronous mode, that failover is usually very quick. And if you're app has any kind of retry logic, you should be pretty much immune to the blip that you'll see in connectivity. So it takes me through that. Let me put back. So that takes me through the demos. Just to review what we've covered, DBAtools, what it is. I recommend going to DBAtools.io and just taking a look. If you're interested in PowerShell at all, it's an amazing resource. Talked about the various options for high availability and disaster recovery in SQL Server, and then how to configure Logshipping with DBAtools, how to get information about your failover cluster instances with DBAtools, and then finally how to create, configure, and monitor availability groups using DBAtools. These are the resources I talked about. So you've got link to the DBAtools homepage, that command index I showed you, the download options. So you've got that installed module. If that doesn't work for you, I think there are 3 different options you can use to get DBAtools installed. And then just specific information about the HADR options I talked about. And then my contact info again. And I don't have a link to the Manning site, but I believe it's just Manning. I don't know if it's Manning.com or ManningBooks.com. I had it pulled up. Yeah, so it's just Manning.com. And if I do a search for, hang on, let me use a different window where I've got my password and I can show you what a live book looks like. And the pub date, I think they said that it is supposed to be ready to ship, I think late June, early July. But this is the live book. It looks like the book does. I've got a table of contents so I can navigate around. And it's just incredibly useful. I can pull it up on my laptop. I can pull it up on my phone. It's a really wonderful resource. So I would, like I say, I would recommend, let me just show you DBAtools.io. So that's the command page. I showed you. You've got all these commands. If I go to availability groups, I can look at, say, invoke DBA failover. This will show me the information that I'd get if I ran, get help against the command. So it's got examples. It's got the various parameters. And then down here, I've got a link if I want to look at the actual source code. Click this, and it will take me to GitHub. And this is the actual code that the command runs. So if you're trying to figure out what it's doing, if you're trying to figure out why it may not be doing what you want it to do, this can be a really useful thing. And it's also a really great way to learn PowerShell because these guys are really, really good at writing PowerShell. And so you can find some great examples if you're trying to do a specific thing. So with that, I will add the link to Manning into the deck before I send Kevin. Is there somewhere I can send this to where you can make it available, the slides and scripts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, I will add the Manning link in before I send it over. But that is what I've got.
All right.
Any
we do
questions?
have a couple of questions before you wrap up.
Sure.
So when you were showing the availability group setup process, Anders asked, can the process actually change the database owner after the availability group is set up?
Yes. I mean, I don't know that the availability, like the command I'm running to build the availability group can do it, but you'd be able to do it with another command. I mean, you can adjust database owner for sure. I guess, Anders, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it looks like, I think he said it was one of the synchronization things.
Let's see, database owner. Let's look at properties real quick. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about it because the database owner shouldn't really affect the availability group, although I've never really monkeyed around with having different database owners for different replicas. But as long as the owner has the same rights and everything, it shouldn't cause a problem.
Fair enough.
So,
the
okay.
other question was, what if the job you want to synchronize is actually on the secondary? Is there anything we could do about that?
That's a really good question. Let me see. So, I don't know if it's a bidirectional because I give it the primary and the secondary. Tell you what, let me see if I can find out. If you don't mind me looking at some documentation.
Reading the docs is important.
It is, and these are wonderful docs. It is just a really amazing thing that it is free. And Chrissy Lemaire is she's the woman who started this whole thing. Rob Sewell has provided a lot of input, as have Joe Pomfret, Claudio Silva, and a bunch of other people. But Chrissy is a rock star. So
absolutely.
Sync dependent objects for availability groups. So yeah, I think it is, in this case, bidirectional, since I only have two. It's telling me that it syncs the following on all replicas found in the DB3 AG. So there it's just specifying a primary. You know, I could run a quick test if you are up for it. Let's see. I'm going to try to create a copy of a job on the secondary and rerun it. I think this should work. Let's see. Job. Let's see. Okay. So now on this side, I've got full and full test. So over here, rerun this. See what happens. Yeah, it looks like it. So that's why you're seeing the two result sets. I was confused by that before. So it was basically, it was writing the jobs to the secondary and then checking and writing back to the primary. And that was why you saw the OLA jobs succeeding against the secondary, but then you were seeing a series for the same jobs where they already existed. So now if I refresh this, we should see that test job. There you go.
There it is.
So like I said, every time I do a presentation, I learn something new. So thank you for that question. Anything else?
Looks like those are the questions from chat.
Okay. Well, as I said, if you have questions about anything, feel free to hit me up. We got any questions about internals or anything else? I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So, but thank you for coming out, and Kevin and Nala, thank you for the opportunity. This is a fun one.
Of course, we appreciate you being here this evening and sharing this knowledge with us. And with that, everybody, we're going to wrap things up for the evening. So thank you all for popping in. Remember, next week we'll be back here with the Business Intelligence and Data Science meeting. So hope to see you then. If not, until we see you next time, everybody, take care.